Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. I'm David Brashear. I'm the director of the Muscarelle Museum of Art. It's great to have all of you with us tonight. We have a wonderful speaker, and I wanted to tell you just a little bit about our speaker series. For the second year in a row now, our series has been supported by generous grants from the Williamsburg Area Arts Commission. So thank you very much to the commission, and we really appreciate the partnership. As I always like to do before we get started is just remind you what we have on the slate for the rest of the fall. Of course, this semester, we're focusing in. We like to do a deep dive with the Muscarelle Explorations and teach you something new, give you an opportunity to become a little bit of an expert. This time we did a deep dive on ourselves this fall. So we're talking about 40 years of the Muscarelle. We have a great exhibition, if you haven't seen it yet, at the Stryker Center in downtown Williamsburg. And part of that exhibition is being also restaged right now in the second floor mezzanine of Phi Beta Kappa Hall. So if you happen to be here for homecoming weekend this weekend, make sure you get up and spend some time looking at it up there. We have two big events still remaining following tonight's lecture this fall. We have the Gallery Players presenting music at the Music Building on November 29th. And then we have a very special visit planned from the artist and scholar Nell Painter. She is going to be with us on December 5th at Commonwealth Auditorium in Sadler Center. So we hope you'll be there to help us welcome Nell Painter. Great little sequence by the docents of the Muscarelle at the Williamsburg Regional Library this month. Every Wednesday at 2 p.m. There are two left, this coming Wednesday, tomorrow, and then next Wednesday, and hope you can make it. The first two have been incredibly interesting, a lot of good support for this program. And then I'm really happy to tell you we move ever closer to our 40th anniversary dinner on Friday, November 17th at the Alumni House. The anniversary dinner, I think we have 250 tickets, and there are only about 50 left right now. So if you're interested in coming, please make your reservation quickly. We'll be welcoming some of the founding forces of the museum. Professor Miles Chappell, the professor who helped move forward the idea of a museum on the college's campus. Architect Carlton Abbott, the architect of Phase 1 and Phase 2, 1983 and 1987 of the Muscarelle Museum. And then, of course, we'll be joined as well by our first director, Dr. Glenn Lowry, who went on to do a few other large things. He's been director of the Museum of Modern Art for the past 27 years. Well, tonight, we're really, really happy to be welcoming Barbara Buehler-Lynes to the Muscarelle Museum. She's an art historian, a curator, professor, and preeminent scholar on the art and the life of Georgia O'Keeffe. And she's actually done a collaboration with the Muscarelle now about 21 or 22 years ago. She retired in 2020 from her position as the Sonny Kaufman Senior Curator at the NSU Museum of Art in Fort Lauderdale to continue her scholarly work on O'Keeffe and American modernism. From 1999 to 2012, Dr. Lynes served as the founding curator of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum in Santa Fe, where she curated or oversaw more than 30 exhibitions of works by O'Keeffe and her contemporaries. And she also served as the director of the museum's research center. Prior to her work at the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum, Dr. Lynes served as an independent consultant to the National Gallery of Art, and she's taught art history at Vanderbilt, Dartmouth, Montgomery College, and the Maryland Institute College of Art. She's written widely on O'Keeffe and other American modernists, including the award-winning 2-volume Georgia O'Keeffe Catalog Raisonné, which was published in 1999. Dr. Lynes holds a PhD in French literature from the University of California, Riverside, and a PhD in art history from Indiana University. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynes.
Okay, thank you very, very much for that lovely introduction. Get going here. I really am happy to be here and happy to see all of you. And please let me know that you can hear me, right, everybody?
Sounds good.
Good? Sound is good? Okay. And as you know, I worked with Anne Madonia about 20 years ago on an exhibition that featured that picture. And I wanted to just review a little about it. This is what I'm going to talk about, but I just have a little interlude of this where it says, Georgia O'Keeffe will receive the honorary degree of Doctor of Fine Arts from the College of William and Mary, Williamsburg, Virginia, at ceremonies taking place on May 7th. Miss O'Keeffe spent her childhood in Williamsburg, going from there to pursue her studies in New York and subsequently to carve for herself an important niche in contemporary American painting. A small, carefully selected exhibition of Miss O'Keeffe's paintings will be held concurrently with the ceremonies, and this was the work that was given to the Muscarelle Art Museum by Mrs. John D. Rockefeller. It's White Flower, 1932, and it's an oil-on panel by 16 by 20 inches. And we could all go look at it, but the museum right now, as you know, is not open. So anyway, it was bestowed because Mrs. John D. Rockefeller gave an O'Keeffe painting to the college, and an exhibition of her art was organized on view May 4th through May 9th, 1938. It included 4 flower paintings, 1 view of New York City, 2 southwestern landscapes, and 1 of the bone paintings that were to become a seminal part of the artist's work. And Anne and I reconstructed that exhibition in 2001, and I gave a talk here in 2001 about that exhibition. It was a lot of fun. Now, I want to move on. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. Now, I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to talk about deconstructing a myth. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about some new things I've discovered when I was working on an exhibition essay for the exhibition that's currently in Albuquerque, New Mexico, on the art of Henry Moore and Georgia O'Keeffe, and it originated at the San Diego Art Museum. So aspects of the significance of the well-received Georgia O'Keeffe retrospective exhibition at New York's Museum of Modern Art in 1946 have long been recognized in the O'Keeffe literature. It was the artist's first retrospective in the epicenter of the American art community, and the museum's second exhibition devoted to the art of a woman. What follows identifies another equally important component of the exhibition's significance, and that is the press release and its subtitle, Finally a Woman on Paper. And let me see if that's no, I don't want to do that yet. Finally a Woman on Paper, codified as fact in 1946, and effectively set into motion, arguably the most popular and pervasive myth about O'Keeffe in the literature, MYTH, myth. That is, the internationally known photographer and gallerist, Alfred Stieglitz, then the leading advocate of modern art in America, exclaimed, "Finally a woman on paper," upon seeing O'Keeffe's work for the first time on December 31st, 1915. Indeed, from 1946 on, the phrase has been repeated nearly annually in reviews of O'Keeffe's exhibitions and in articles, books, and biographies about her. Yet, as will become clear, Stieglitz did not say, "Finally a woman on paper," in 1915. He did not, despite the 1946 exhibition press release assertion that he did. And I found this a very interesting thing to finally discover. And I'll go through it with you because it lays out why this perception was created and how it was resolved. Exhibition curator James Johnson Sweeney was instrumental in preparing the exhibition 12-page press release. And this was 9 pages longer than those typical from the museum. And you see him here with Georgia O'Keeffe and then by himself in 2 different images. This 12-page press release included the exhibition checklist, lists of O'Keeffe's earlier exhibitions and her paintings in public collections, her curriculum vitae, and information on her background and education. It also explained that her work had been influenced by the artist and teacher Arthur Wesley Dow, and included O'Keeffe's descriptions of important moments in the development of her art. There were also examples from the essay Sweeney was preparing for the exhibition, which was never published. And this is really too bad that Sweeney never published this catalog. He did publish a catalog for Alfred Stieglitz's photographs a couple of years later, and he also organized an exhibition of O'Keeffe's art when he was in Houston, at the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. And a catalog for that he did not contribute to either. So we never really have his feelings about O'Keeffe's art, except in this press release, which was taken from parts of what he was going to put in his catalog. The press release also featured a 1916 O'Keeffe letter to Stieglitz, who became her dealer that year, and her husband in 1924. Its third page drew attention to this letter and to how Sweeney had obtained it. It, quote, "In the catalog, Mr. Sweeney quotes from a considerable group of unpublished early correspondence, generally put at his display by Miss O'Keeffe, between the artist and her discoverer, Alfred Stieglitz," unquote. Now, this is unusual because O'Keeffe kept this correspondence under wraps until 25 years after her death, even though some scholars had access to it, a correspondence between her and O'Keeffe. And the fact that she allowed someone to read it at that time and to quote from it, it was pretty amazing to me. The, quote, unpublished early correspondence, however, also included letters O'Keeffe had written in June, August, and October 1915, and January 16 to her New York friend and former classmate there, Anita Politzer. And this is a picture of Anita Politzer. Anita Politzer was very involved in the National Woman's Party, which was the most radical feminist group of the early 20th century. And she ultimately became the chief component, the executive director of that group. O'Keeffe was teaching in South Carolina and had mailed her friend a series of recently completed drawings, and I'll show you one of them here. This is number 20 from Music Special from 1915. Despite O'Keeffe's directive to show them to no one, Politzer, who knew Stieglitz, took them to him at his famous Avant Gallery 291 on December 31st, 1915. When he saw them, he supposedly proclaimed, "Finally, a woman on paper." To be sure, the exhibition's subtitle recalls Stieglitz's description of O'Keeffe's innovative abstractions when he first exhibited them in 1916. And this is the press release for that exhibition. He then wrote, 291 has never before seen, this is what he actually wrote, and this is the press release that shows "Finally, a Woman on Paper" featured as the subtitle of the exhibition. He then wrote in 1916, when he showed O'Keeffe's work for the first time, that 291, which was his famous avant-garde gallery, had never before seen woman express herself so frankly on paper. And the phrase is also reminiscent of how Stieglitz described O'Keeffe's work in a late 1917 or early 1918 letter to his friend, photographer Anne Brigman, sent after the one-person exhibition Stieglitz organized in 1917. He stated, "The room 291 has never been more glorious than during its last exhibition. The work of Miss O'Keeffe, a woman on paper, fearless, pure, self-expression." And Stieglitz used similar words when writing O'Keeffe in 1918. And here we have an image of O'Keeffe from approximately that time. She was teaching in Texas at that time, and he wrote her, "Of course, I am wondering what you have been painting, what it looks like, what you have been full of, the great child, pouring out some more of her woman's self on paper, purely, truly unspoiled." Yet none of these words that Stieglitz uttered in 16, 17, or 18 have the drama and promotional impact of "Finally, a woman on paper." Had Stieglitz uttered the phrase in 1915, Pulitzer would have, I assume, Pulitzer would have remembered it when she wrote to O'Keeffe that evening after she had taken O'Keeffe's work to Stieglitz. Yet in her ink-written letter, she pinned in cursive, it did not include it. And see if I can get up here and show you exactly where these words are on the page. Let me just get a little bit closer here. You see I've got a laser pointer here that should be working. Yes. Why they're genuinely fine things. It starts right there. Why they are genuinely fine things. You see it? Yeah. You say a woman did these. Say a woman, she's a broad-minded, she's bigger than most women, but she's got that sensitive emotion. I'd know that she was a woman. Look at that line. That gets cut off. But then he says, these are the purest, finest, sincerest things that have entered 291 in a long time. I wouldn't mind showing them at all in one of these rooms one bit. Now, this is what he actually wrote, okay? This is what Pulitzer actually wrote, in ink, in cursive, all right? Now, would not O'Keeffe have repeated Finally a Woman on Paper when writing her close friend, Arthur McMahon, on January 6th? And this is a picture of O'Keeffe with McMahon. This was her first, quote, boyfriend. And he came down to visit her in the fall of 1915. Yet what she wrote to Pulitzer was, Stieglitz liked them, my drawings, very much. Said they were the purest, finest, sincerest things that had entered 291 in a long time, that he might want to show them later. The absence of the phrase in O'Keeffe's letter suggests it was not in Pulitzer's letter originally, in the ink-written letter. And yet it is there now, and I have to show it to you now. Do you see it now? It's right there. Finally, a woman on paper, he said. And notice that it is in pencil, and it's printed, not in ink and not in cursive. It thus differs in medium, style, and tone from the more reasoned Stieglitz reaction Pulitzer recorded in ink. When I first saw this letter at the Beinecke Library, Rare Book and Manuscript Library in the mid-1980s, I wondered how, when, and why Pulitzer inserted these words, printed in pencil, into an ink-penned letter that had been in O'Keeffe's possession since 1916. In other words, how could she do that? O'Keeffe owned that letter, and how did these words get inserted into it? The different mediums in the letter were first noticed in the literature in 1983, and the penciled phrase was then seen as something Pulitzer perhaps inserted at the last moment as an afterthought before mailing the letter on January 1st, 1916. Yet this difference in medium was soon obscured by the 1990 publication of the O'Keeffe-Pulitzer correspondence. And this is the image of that book, which is called Lovingly, Georgia. It misdated Pulitzer's December 31, 1915 letter to January 1st, 1916. And it included the phrase, but it didn't mention that it was inserted between the lines of the letter. And it made no distinction between the fact that it was written in pencil and the rest of the letter was pen. Thus, anyone consulting the book, rather than the original letter, would not know that the phrase, finally a woman on paper, was inserted in pencil and might not be original to it. Considering O'Keeffe did not include the phrase in her letter to McMahon and its history in the O'Keeffe literature, which I'm going to talk about, it is more probable then that Pulitzer inserted the phrase in 1946, that's my proposal, or shortly thereafter, when the phrase and its origin story were validated, in fact, in the 1946 O'Keeffe exhibition press release. It's right there. Although supposedly uttered in 1915, Finally a Woman on Paper did not appear in the literature until 13 years later, which seems odd given that a great deal had been written about O'Keeffe since 1916, and that the phrase was later considered eminently quotable. It was in reviewing O'Keeffe's 1928 exhibition that Stieglitz's friend, Louis Kallenheim, first recorded the phrase and its origin story. Finally, a woman on paper, or words to that general effect. Stieglitz is reported to have said, quite moved, to the New York girlfriend of O'Keeffe's, who had brought the drawings to him. That's Louis Kallenheim in 1928. Yet this phrase never took hold in the O'Keeffe literature. Both the phrase and its origin story surfaced only 13 years later in a 1941 anonymously written entry on O'Keeffe in Current Biography. And it says, without her permission, the friend showed the drawings to Alfred Stieglitz, who is said to have ejaculated, finally, a woman on paper. Now, ejaculated rarely describes something said. Rather, it refers to the pleasure of male sexual climax. Its use here suggests that Stieglitz wrote or provided input for the entry, as he greatly enjoyed provoking controversy. Moreover, the word alludes to how O'Keeffe and her art aroused and satisfied him, as well as to how he had perceived and promoted her art since 1916, basically as the manifestation of female sexuality. 2 years passed before the phrase and its origin story were next cited. O'Keeffe's and Stieglitz's friend, curator Dan Caton-Rich, referred to both in the essay for the catalog of O'Keeffe's first retrospective exhibition that he organized at the Art Institute of Chicago in 1943. He again refers to it. To Anita Politzer in New York, sent in 1916, that's a mistake, a roll of sketches with the express condition that they were not to be shown to anyone. Disobeying O'Keeffe's request, she promptly tucked the roll under her arm and took them to one of the few men in America capable of appreciating them, Alfred Stieglitz. He was instantly impressed by them and said, finally, a woman on paper, he remarked. And this is what Daniel Rich wrote in the catalog. One wonders if Rich cited the phrase and its origin story at Stieglitz's suggestion, as it had not gained much traction in the literature, even after the 1941 provocative essay in Current Biography. And remember that Rich and Stieglitz and O'Keeffe were very, very good friends. That Rich was unaware of the sexist implications of the phrase and its origin story are clear from his catalog essay. It was the first in the literature to disassociate O'Keeffe's art from the sexualized interpretations that had dominated its reception since 1916. Rich stated, in the first review of the exhibit in Stieglitz's own magazine, Camera Work, there occurs the suggestion that these drawings may be of psychoanalytic interest. Exciting as this observation was to a period fascinated by Freud, it has been in the long run harmful to O'Keeffe's case as an artist. It set off a whole train of mystic and sexual explanations of her art, which has sometimes stood in the way of understanding. Finally, a woman on paper was quoted once in the reviews of the 1943 Chicago exhibition as at last a woman on paper, and again in 1943 in both forms, in 1945, in both forms. There are annual exhibitions of O'Keeffe's every year. If not retrospectives, they're on view someplace every year, and there's always criticism. I have a huge data file of all of these reviews, and have written extensively about them. Janet Hollis reviewed O'Keeffe's exhibition at Stieglitz's gallery in 1945. At last, a woman on paper, she said. And finally, a woman on paper was used in the title and cited at the text of an article in O'Keeffe in USA and American Review. But neither the phrase nor its origin story caught on in the O'Keeffe literature until 1946, when both were authenticated as fact in the O'Keeffe exhibition press release and subsequently repeated regularly in the literature. As seemingly unaware of the phrase's sexist implication as Rich, Sweeney wrote, whoops, what did I do here? There we go. These words, finally a woman on paper, spoken by Alfred Stieglitz in 1915, were the actual launching of O'Keeffe, of Georgia O'Keeffe. That's James Johnson Sweeney. And as I mentioned before, he and O'Keeffe were very good friends, and also with Stieglitz. Curiously, giving her later refusal to condone associating her art with her gender, O'Keeffe voiced no known objection to the phrase or its origin. And here we have O'Keeffe, just as an image of her, done by Ansel Adams. She's painting in her car at Ghost Ranch. She most probably held the same opinion then that she expressed in an interview with Michael Gold in 1930, which is about, this is 1937, but 1930. And she stated then in this interview, "I am trying with all my skill to do a painting that is all of woman as well as all of me," unquote. She had first articulated her feelings about this issue when writing Pulitzer on January 4th in 1916 about her 1915 charcoal abstractions. She wrote, "The thing," and she means her work, "seems to express in a way what I want it to, but it also seems rather effeminate. It is essentially a woman's feeling, satisfies me in a way," unquote. And in 1946, like the men, O'Keeffe may have believed that Stieglitz had uttered, "finally a woman on paper," when first seeing her work. And she may have realized that the phrase, while referring to her own accomplishments, also indirectly referred to Stieglitz. Long before the 1946 exhibition, Stieglitz had realized, arguably, his most outstanding achievement, an extensive photographic portrait of O'Keeffe. He completed it between 1917 and 1937, when he retired from photography, and it was clearly his own, quote, "woman on paper." Photographs are paper. Stieglitz's early photographs of O'Keeffe often presented his subject in the nude, partially dressed, and occasionally posed in front of her abstract works, gesturing toward them with her hands. He had exhibited 45 of them in 1921, when he was still married to his first wife and living with the unmarried O'Keeffe, and the exhibition, of course, created a sensation. Clearly, Sweeney had O'Keeffe's woman on paper in mind. In excerpts from his catalog essay, which the press release included, he subtly referred to the 1921 exhibition. He stated that O'Keeffe's work was an expression of intense emotion, stark but always constrained. It is the essence of O'Keeffe's art, and the way she came to this was by the severest critical self-stripping. The anonymous critic for Time magazine riffed on Sweeney's words, making "austere stripper" the title of the review, and art critic Henry McBride's review referred to the event directly. He says, "There came to notice almost at once something about some photographs showing every conceivable aspect of O'Keeffe. That was a new effort in photography and something new in the way of introducing a budding artist. It made a stir. Mona Lisa got but one portrait of herself worth talking about. O'Keeffe got 100. It put her at once on the map. Everybody knew the name. She became what is known as a newspaper personality." That Sweeney was thinking about Stieglitz's woman on paper is also evidence from his suggestion that Stieglitz exhibit examples of his portrait in a gallery adjacent to the O'Keeffe exhibition. And I'll show you two more of these images. Stieglitz rejected the idea because he said it would not represent the breadth of his achievement. Yet this was perhaps an excuse, knowing full well that the 1921 exhibition had upset and outraged O'Keeffe. It provided visual equivalents for how Stieglitz was promoting O'Keeffe's art and promoted critics to view her work through a Freudian lens and to associate her art with her body and her sexuality. Indeed, and perhaps at O'Keeffe's insistence, he only occasionally exhibited one or several of these photographs during his lifetime after 1921. I find that really interesting. They weren't shown again until 1983, when O'Keeffe organized an exhibition of them at the Met. Whatever the case, O'Keeffe was in support of most of Sweeney's efforts on her behalf in 1946. She had allowed him to publish one of her letters to Stieglitz in the press release and had asked Politzer to provide him with letters she had sent to Politzer. So Politzer went to her files and got out letters that she had from O'Keeffe and lent them to Sweeney. The women had remained friends and were both living in New York in 1926 until June, when O'Keeffe left for New Mexico. And here's an image of O'Keeffe and Politzer together. Politzer had made the letters she received from O'Keeffe, she had made the letters she had received from O'Keeffe available to Sweeney. And because Politzer was preparing a review of O'Keeffe's 1946 exhibition, she must have asked O'Keeffe in turn for letters that she had written O'Keeffe. And in reviewing her December 1931-1915 letter, Politzer must have realized finally a woman on paper was not there. Politzer was then unaware of the degree to which the phrase's promotional ring differed from the more cautious Stieglitz response she had described in the original letter, its history and origin story in the literature, or that inserting it then in pencil would later call its originality into question. And you could see it there again, how it's up at the top in pencil right up here. Let me get that. You could see it right up there. Finally, where is this? Sometimes that, there we go. Can you see it? It's right there. Okay. Yet she knew that finally on Woman on Paper had become the mantra of the 1946 press release, and may well have thought that she had not remembered exactly what Stieglitz had responded when she showed him O'Keeffe's work in 1915, some 30 years earlier. She thus amended, I think, her letter to correspond with the premise and the subtitle of the 1946 exhibition. Press release, finally a woman on paper. She either added it then or shortly thereafter when she was preparing the article, That's Georgia, published in Saturday Review in 1950. In it, she cited the phrase woman on paper and its origin story once again, as was the case in her posthumously published book about O'Keeffe, A Woman on Paper. So I hope I've convinced you, because it really was a mystery to me for a very long time. Stieglitz died on July 13th at 83 during the run of O'Keeffe's exhibition, but not before enjoying the adulation heaped on him in Sweeney's press release and the critical response it and the exhibition generated. While these materials celebrated O'Keeffe and her astonishing achievements, they also drew inordinate attention to Stieglitz. For example, the press release stated, and I'm going to show you that, again, I'm going to read you something else. For more than a decade, Stieglitz had been introducing to the American public the most modern painting and sculpture from abroad, as well as the most advanced American art. Additionally, it highlighted the role he had played in discovering, promoting, and championing O'Keeffe's art, the annual exhibitions he had organized of it, as well as the avant-garde publications he had founded, 291 and Camera Work, calling them the most radical publications of their kind. Indeed, adulation for Stieglitz so dominated the press review and the criticism that one critic for Art News called attention to it. He wrote, George O'Keeffe's full-length retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art is a very useful affair. If you walk through it before you read the catalog, and what he means is the press release, you will be able to form your own picture of what she represents in American art without interruptions on the part of Mr. Stieglitz. The 291 publicity technique need not bewilder you in all its wonderful simplicity until you feel ready to take it. So I think, that's pretty interesting in terms of what it reveals. In Stieglitz's dominating the reviews of the show. Whether Stieglitz suggested the exhibition subtitle to Sweeney or played a part in developing the press release will never be known. But the 1946 exhibition served both artists well. Its press release highlighted the significance of O'Keeffe's breakthrough charcoal drawings while alluding to Stieglitz's Woman on Paper, and validated as truth the myth of his prescience in immediately realizing her potential and as early as 1915. And I'm showing you a photograph of the two of them together, taken in 44, 2 years before the exhibition and 2 years before his death. In it and the press release inexorably linked the two, hitching the aging Stieglitz to the star the much younger artist had become, providing Stieglitz a permanent place in the O'Keeffe literature. Indeed, it is not possible to think about and to discuss O'Keeffe's life and her art or her career without mentioning Stieglitz. While this may continue to be the case, it is now clear for the first time that Stieglitz was not as perceptive in 1915 as the myth of his saying, "Finally a woman on paper," implied. He did not come up with the phrase in its origin story until over a decade later, when he developed it as a promotional tool. Stieglitz had no way of knowing that the phrase was not part of the Pulitzer letter that described his reaction to first seeing O'Keeffe's work, but was instead added decades later, nor could he have imagined that letter would ultimately reveal as myth the 1940 press release and its subtitle's assertion that Stieglitz had uttered "Finally a woman on paper" as early as 1915. I think he was feeling like he was fading, and getting himself hitched to O'Keeffe in that way really worked, because after 1946, "Finally a Woman on Paper" has been in the reviews every year of O'Keeffe's art and anything written about her. And I've watched videos where biographers say, and he saw her art and said, "Finally a woman on paper." So it was really fun to figure that out. Now, I'm going to turn to another discovery that I made while I was writing an essay for the catalog of the O'Keeffe and Henry Marshall, which I mentioned. And it opened at the San Diego Museum, and it's now, I told you, at Albuquerque Museum. Certainly, since the 1980s, when art historians and biographers began to write O'Keeffe and her accomplishments, many of her innovations within the history of American art have become clear. First, and I mentioned this before, she was, her 1915 charcoal abstractions were highly innovative, as she was among a handful of American artists, namely Arthur Dove, to express herself through abstraction at that point. And beginning in the mid-20s, she revolutionized the history of flower paintings with images such as Black Iris from 1926. By presenting the large-scale images of flowers as seen close-up, as if through a close-up lens or a magnifying glass, for which she has only recently been acknowledged and credited. I mean, people hadn't thought about how revolutionary that was. And with the image of her that she allowed numerous important photographers to make of her after Stieglitz's death, she was able to create her own self-image. And I'm showing you one of the provocative images he made of her early on, and then this 1956 photograph of her by Joseph Karsh. After Stieglitz's death, she allowed numerous American photographers to make photographs of her, and in them, she set forth her own public image that differed dramatically from the sexualized image Stieglitz had established in the 1910s and 20s. She personifies herself as a serious, hardworking professional rather than as a woman expressing her sexuality in her work. Another innovation in her work involved the concept of seeing things from a distance and from seeing them close up at the same time in images that conjoin such points of view, as in Untitled Red and Yellow Cliffs. Now, that's a photograph I made of those red and yellow cliffs when I was out in Santa Fe. I did an exhibition on the relationship between O'Keeffe's paintings of these places and actual photographs of them. And it was very interesting because she works her way back to abstraction through a landscape in New Mexico. So you see the cliffs from close up in her image. You're standing in front of them, they're monumental, while seeing the trees whose size implies that we see them from a great distance. You have to be 10, 15 miles away to see the trees that little. Or seeing forms from above, such as this, where we're looking down at the lake, and yet we're looking directly into the picture. And we know that she called the first kind of thing from the faraway nearby, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But these are visual manipulations in her art that I think are very, very interesting. Writing about Moore and O'Keeffe's work heightened my awareness of another component of her work, her ability to activate a two-dimensional surface with seemingly three-dimensional sculptural forms. This aspect of it was first noticed by Lloyd Goodrich, who organized the 1970 retrospective of O'Keeffe's art at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And I'm going to show you number special 13 from 1916-17. He wrote about this work. These are his words. Almost all of these drawings are abstract. Their forms suggest those of nature, but without specific imagery. They are marked by a sense of movement, but representation of moving things, not representation of moving things, but movement in the forms themselves. The three separate elements, the undulating rising form, the succession of swelling bud-like shapes, and the series of acute angles move in different yet related tempos in a contrapuntal style. In her book, Three Women, Three Artists, Anne Middleton Wagner used the term embodied and disembodied to describe self-portraits O'Keeffe completed in 1917, implying their sculptural qualities. And she used the term embodiment in discussing Moore's work, too. And in the 2001 painting Gender Constructing Theory, the Alfred Stieglitz Circle in American Formalist Aesthetics, Marcia Brennan discussed the inferior and exteriority of O'Keeffe's flower paintings, implying their sculptural quality, and she coined the term embodied formalism to characterize the aesthetic of O'Keeffe's work and that of the Stieglitz Circle artists. Now, I came upon this realization when I was looking at a photograph of O'Keeffe's painting at the Norton Museum of Art. I'm showing you with a work from the Phillips. But another component in some of O'Keeffe's work, not all of it, lends them to an even greater and previously unnoted sculptural quality. That is, in the one work, she synthesizes different points of view simultaneously, as can be seen by comparing this painting of the Ranchos de Taos Church with Paul Strand's photograph of it. And you can see, we see the church in Strand's work from one point of view. That's what the camera does. It captures it from one point of view. With the O'Keeffe, we see it from several, both the left, the front, and the right. In other words, we move around it. And what is this thing? Here we go. There it is. Yeah, you see, in his work, we can't see the left flank. But here we can see it, and it actually bulges out. So it's as if we're moving around the object. We're moving around the architectural form. And this also characterizes a very early image that O'Keeffe did. This is O'Keeffe painting her own body when she was in communication with Stieglitz by letters from Texas to New York City, and telling him that these were portraits of herself. And you can see that she's turned her legs toward the viewer. This is slightly blurry, for which I apologize. And we also see that her breast is in profile. So it's a synthesis of 2 points of view. The concept of one work presenting simultaneity relates this component of works to Cubism, which O'Keeffe became aware of in the mid-20s. Whoops, did I go past that? Wait a minute. Yeah, to Cuban. The exhibition, let's see, in which O'Keeffe became aware of in the mid-20s through her contact with Stieglitz. The exhibition he organized and the images produced in camera work. Her 59th Street studio, which you see there on the left, depicts a series of interacting and interrelated geometric shapes, which may be a nod to that movement, but some may actually derive from the subject itself, the doors and windows of this architectural space. Yet in certain paintings, and especially in Rancho's Church, she achieved such simultaneity through seamless, smooth transitions, revealing what we might refer to as a kind of organic cubism within her work. Whether she was conscious of doing this, we really can't say, because she never talks about it, at least not in the thousands of letters I've read. But realizing its presence in her paintings adds a new dimension to its sculptural qualities and to the innovative aspects of her work. And I think it was conscious, and I think she was competing with photography. And I think she was showing you that her paintings could do more than photography. They could show you things from more than one point of view. Thank you very much.